vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics.
No, your eyes are not fooling you. This is Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection. Or rather, Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics. From Capcom, if you can believe it.
You win. Round 2. Fight. Tornado Claw.
Showtime. Round 1. Fight. Red swing.
I feel the Arcade Classics subtitle is a tad bit redundant, but who am I to say? I'm not the CEO of Capcom here. This was probably mine and many others' most anticipated game of the year, which is nothing more than a compilation of 7 games that haven't been re-released for quite some time. In the case of MVC2, which is probably the biggest highlight in this collection, it's been well over 15 years since the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network releases of those games have been delisted from those platforms. Suffice to say, it was a pretty dark day for gamers, but now we have the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection to bring us joy again, on top of reintroducing many of Capcom's other classic Marvel-related titles. You have the likes of The Punisher, which is a pretty neat beat-em-up. It was a bit of an outlier for this collection, and I'm kind of glad that they incorporated it. It makes me hopeful that at some point Capcom will acknowledge the likes of other games like Alien vs. Predator and bring that to a collection of some sort. In any case, The Punisher plays fairly similarly to the likes of Final Fight, so if you enjoy that series of Capcom arcade beat-em-ups, you'll definitely feel right at home with The Punisher. It's got a lot of cool mechanics like dodge rolling, roundhouse kicks, being able to pick up and fling your enemies amongst other groups of enemies, and you can even throw down grenades and blow them up too. It's a pretty rad game. Why, you can even give bad guys an American hello by pulling out your pistol and shooting them square in the face, so long as they're armed and dangerous themselves. Otherwise, the Punisher generally uses his fists to enact justice. But the collection doesn't stop there. It also incorporates the likes of X-Men, Children of the Atom, Marvel, Superheroes, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel vs. Street Fighter, Marvel vs. Capcom, and of course, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. All fantastic fighting games, and as I stated before, many of them haven't seen a re-release for quite a long time. Some much longer than others, but I think I speak for a lot of people when I say the main highlight of this collection is quite definitely Marvel vs. Capcom 2. All the games are presented in a container that is very reminiscent to Capcom's previous collection of arcade fighting games, known as the Capcom Fighting Collection. The menu on display here is relatively functional. It does exactly what it needs to, no more, no less. To briefly talk about the individual games here in terms of their emulation and performance, I can safely say they're all pretty gosh darn good. I mean, these are 20-plus-year-old ROMs of arcade games, so I would at least hope they would perform well on consoles like the PS5 or PS4, Nintendo Switch, and PCs alike. The collection is also said to have a release for the Xbox One series of consoles sometime in 2025. As I previously stated, these are the arcade versions of these games, so don't expect any of the additions made to the home console ports of any of these games. which I think is fine. I think most people just wanted to play these games in some way, shape, or form on a modern platform with online connectivity, which is to say that the online is pretty gosh darn smooth. If you want to play these games specifically for online connectivity, the rollback netcode incorporated with all of these games, and especially Marvel vs. Capcom 2, is extremely smooth and a delightful experience to say the least.
I'm a member of STAR.
Hey!
In terms of additional features here for this collection, you do have the option to alter the visual presentation of these games, which is where I have one of my first complaints. I think the various additional filters that are incorporated here are pretty lackluster, to say the least. This sounds like a petty nitpick, but when you consider Capcom force a scanline filter on every game upon booting them up for the first time, I feel more than vindicated to complain about this. I think the filter that they choose upon booting up every game is way too dark for my liking. It's a genuine disservice to the overall quality of the sprite artwork and the animations on display here. Thankfully, you can easily turn them off, but the fact that I have to go through the extra steps to go into the menu and turn them off all individually, there is no all-encompassing universal menu to just disable them automatically for every game. You also have the ability to change the aspect ratios, which is kind of a nice gesture. If you want to stretch your games out completely to the full screen, you can. If you even want to sort of squish them back to their native 4:3 aspect ratio, you also have the ability to do that as well. Why, you even have a selection of borders to accompany your game, so it makes it stand out a bit more on the sides. Or you can even just completely turn it off and get some black bars. The options available here are very basic, but again, relatively serviceable. This collection also has the addition of a museum, which includes many images for each individual game, containing design documents, development artwork, and even promotional artwork in resolutions that have not been seen by the public eye ever. The amount of detail many of these images have is very daunting. Some of these images have been present online in some way, shape, or form, but never in such a high quality. And I have to give this game credit to having all of this stuff available for the public for the first time. There's also a music player that has every game's individual soundtrack. You can have the option to combine them all into a randomized playlist, or you can go into each individual game release and listen to the soundtracks in order, or of course, randomize them from a game-to-game basis, which is relatively nice. Although I will say I feel like I am not the target audience for this sort of feature. I like the fact that we have access to all this cool promotional and development images, especially at such a high resolution, but a lot of this stuff doesn't really interest me outside of my first interaction with them. So upon looking through the museum at least once or twice, maybe specifically just for the likes of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 or The Punisher, I never really want to look at this menu ever again otherwise. If someone goes out of their way to rip the images out and make them publicly available either on the Internet Archive or a Google Drive or even individually on some sort of Twitter post or something, that's something that I would probably appreciate more. Otherwise, a lot of these images are just stuck in the game, and I really have no incentive to look at them after the first time. As for the music player, I wish you had the ability to have access to it during training modes or during online play, just so you can listen to different soundtracks while playing another game. I don't know, it just feels kind of useless having this cool music player and just having it as a standalone feature when I could easily just download the soundtracks to these games or even just listen to them on YouTube to my leisure. I guess you could argue that you could listen to the music player while waiting for fighting game matches, but I would much prefer to be playing the available training modes in order to practice my combos, maybe check out my frame data, my inputs, the hitboxes for each of the individual characters. There's a lot of great information and features in the training modes, but I digress. I think the main point of interest for many people is the actual online itself for each of these individual games, alongside whether or not they are tournament or competitively viable for the higher end of the player base. And I can safely say for the casual consumer, this is definitely a worthwhile package of games. It is extremely easy to pick up and play these games online. The rollback netcode is extremely smooth, as I previously stated. All the games run like a dream, and you even have the option to go into the in-game network settings to pick whether or not you want to play with players at a certain internet connection. So if you want to play with players with a higher internet connection, or if you want to play with every player with any sort of internet connection, that is an available possibility. You even have the option to mess around with your input delay settings, and you can even adjust this in between matches, so that is extremely convenient. Suffice to say, if you're somebody that can't really get something like Fightcade or Null DC running up properly, this is the game for you. This is the game that is aimed at consumers like you. Now, prior to the completion of this review, I was going to say that this collection was less focused on the competitive side of things. It seems that many competitive players have seen both issues with MVC2 alongside many of the other fighting games in this collection that have patched out certain glitches that were viable in competitive play. For instance, the Juggernaut glitch, where Juggernaut would power himself up, get tagged out, then get tagged back in order to retain that power-up for the rest of the match. That was completely removed from MVC2. That is, until they re-added it as a feature. So if you wanted to play with the Juggernaut glitch, you had the option to turn it on, or if you want to play without it, you can turn it off as well. I like the fact that Capcom were listening to the fans and were able to reincorporate it in a way that was very smart for both sides of the spectrum. Fans who were more casual, who didn't really like these sort of glitches, have the option to turn it off, whereas competitive players have the ability to reintroduce it and play how they've been playing it previously. That being said, it seems that there are other issues within the collection itself that may deter a lot of the competitive players and just stick to the original Dreamcast release, or even playing on Fightcade for their Marvel vs. Capcom competitive fix. But I think it's safe to say that Capcom are at least listening to the consumer base and wanting to improve on this collection however they can. So I'm very hopeful that in the near future that this might be the definitive way to play Marvel vs. Capcom 2, not just casually, but in a competitive sense as well. Overall, I think that the Marvel vs. Capcom collection is a very solid collection of games otherwise. Ideally, I would have wished that Capcom had priced the game at $40 similarly to their previous collection of games, but I imagine that they knew in the back of their minds, people love Marvel, people love Marvel vs. Capcom, and of course people love, specifically, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. If they were ever going to charge an extra premium for any game, it would definitely have been this one, because it seems like this game has been selling like hotcakes. It's been a long time coming for a decent port of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 that was accessible to the public and not priced at $200 or something absurd like that. However, if you were on the competitive side of things, Fightcade might still seem like a very viable option for that sort of scene, but I would also argue that this version of the game probably has the biggest amount of players available. I think the one missed opportunity of this collection that I really wish Capcom would have included is some sort of cross-play compatibility. As of right now, I believe the PC version in particular is the most popular version of the game, as well as the PlayStation 4 version, but I can see versions like the Nintendo Switch or the Xbox One versions of these games not really having a high retention for the player base, so it would have been really convenient to have all of these player bases combined into one. Then this probably would have been the best version of the game, specifically on that alone. Maybe in the future they can add that as a patch update, but I'm highly doubtful, as it seems like an extremely intensive and premium feature in most games today, so that definitely doesn't really work in this game's favor, unfortunately. But I still think that the current player base, as well as just having a convenient copy of the game to play offline with friends or family, makes this a very worthwhile package in the grand scheme of things. That's all I really had to say about this collection, so hopefully you found it informative in some way, shape, or form. Thank you for watching, and until next time.
Don't give up. Challenge again.